Onto your headphones and pour your favorite beverage. It's time for the Kickin or Stickin Fantasy Football Podcast. Now, fresh off the sidelines, your host, Matt McPeak.
Fantasy freaks and geeks, what is up? Welcome to the Kickin or Stickin Fantasy Football Podcast, where we try and make your fantasy decisions just a little bit easier. Today we're going to be going over the coaching changes for 2020. There are 5 new head coaches. There are 7 new offensive coordinators, but I think only 5 of them are actually going to call plays. So we're going to go through all 12 of these guys. We're going to look at the players on these teams that are going to probably be the most impacted by these coaching changes. And the first one we're going to start off with is Matt Rule down in Carolina. He ran an RPO offense at Baylor after a history of running smash mouth offenses. Has experience coaching on both sides of the ball. He coached linebackers, D-line, and special teams in Albright, Buffalo, UCLA, and Western Carolina. He coached the D-line and then quarterbacks before becoming offensive coordinator in his first time around at Temple. Then he was an assistant O-line coach for the Giants in 2012. Went back to college. He was the head coach at Temple and then Baylor. So he definitely has the resume, and I think he'll be a really good NFL coach. He brings with him Joe Brady, offensive coordinator. He's going to be the offensive coordinator for this Panthers team, but I think Matt Rule is going to continue to call plays. Joe Brady was the passing game coordinator and coached wide receivers at LSU last season, so he was 2 years experience as a offensive assistant to Sean Payton in New Orleans before that. So he's definitely got some experience as well. Last year, Baylor had 3 different players get over 100 carries and 8 players that had over 10 yards per catch. Baylor ran an explosive, dynamic, they were versatile offense, heavy RPOs and options. Teddy Bridgewater and the XFL MVP, if they were to award that to somebody from this past season, PJ Walker, will duke it out for that quarterback spot, and whoever wins will have a really good crew of weapons around him. The trio of newly signed Robbie Anderson, Curtis Samuel, DJ Moore could be one of the better trios of wide receivers in the league, and then you add in Christian McCaffrey as the best pass-catching running back possibly ever. Also with Greg Olsen in Seattle now, Ian Thomas has a good opportunity as any tight end going into his third year. And let me remind you of the rest of the tight ends from that 2017 class, the guys that are going into their third year as a pro. O.J. Howard, David Njoku, Evan Ingram, Gerald Everett, and Jake Butt, all guys that have either underperformed or they've gotten hurt. So, there's a good chance that in a couple of years we could be saying that Ian Thomas is the best tight end to come out of that class, which is kind of surprising when you look at O.J. Howard in particular, how talented he was or still is, and where he was drafted. Next, we got Kevin Stefanski going to the Cleveland Browns. He was an offensive assistant in Minnesota for years before filling in for John DeFilippo after getting fired for not running the ball enough under Mike Zimmer. We'll get to that in a little bit. He brings Alex Van Pelt, Cincinnati's quarterback coach from last year, to Cleveland with him. But I think Stefanski will call plays. Under Zimmer, the Vikings had the 4th most rushing attempts, the 6th most rushing yards, and the 6th most rushing touchdowns, while throwing the 9th fewest yards and the 3rd fewest attempts, and most importantly, the 5th fewest interceptions in the league. So this was a low-risk passing offense. They ran the ball, and they ran the hell out of the ball up in Minnesota. They also ran the 3rd most plays out of the 12 personnel last year. So I think we'll see Hooper and David Njoku on the field at the same time a lot. Last year, the Vikings tight ends group had a 23% target share. Although there are a lot of mouths to feed in Cleveland with Beckham and Landry penciled in for a good 120 targets each, and the running backs most likely getting at least 100 between Chubb and Hunt, and figure probably another 100 going to the pair of tight ends. This might end up being one of the most concentrated offenses in football, with maybe 85 upwards to 90% of their targets going to just 5 guys. So yes, it does kind of suck thinking about taking a Browns offensive player for your league because of, how much talent they have there and how many mouths there are to feed. But we saw last year there was a couple offenses. One in particular that comes to mind is the LA Chargers. They stuck with those same 5 or 6 guys almost every single play. So maybe it's not the worst thing in the world to go after, Jarvis Landry as a second or even third wide receiver. The next guy is Ron Rivera. So he brings offensive coordinator Scott Turner with him from Carolina. And honestly, I have no idea what kind of offense they will run, but it is most certainly going to be centered around the running game and the crew of running backs that they have in Washington. Scott Turner, the son of longtime NFL coach Norv Turner, was the QB coach for the Panthers for the last 2 years, and the Vikings for the 3 years before that, with one season in between as an offensive analyst. Last year, after Ron Rivera and Norv Turner was fired, Scott took over calling plays for the last 4 games of the season, and that quarter of the season was the lowest scoring quarter of the season for the Panthers. Kyle Allen started 3 of those 4 games, and he threw 6 of his 16 interceptions in those 3 games. The one game that Allen did not start, Scott Turner was the offensive coordinator for, Will Greer got the start, and he threw 3 interceptions and no touchdowns. So I don't know if this is a sign of Turner's coaching or if it's just the talent that he had around him towards the end of last year in Carolina. The only good thing to come out of those 4 games that Turner was the OC was getting Christian McCaffrey the record for receptions by a running back, which was well over 100. I forget what the exact number was. I think it was like 120 or so. So it will be interesting to see if that was a result of the offense or if Scott Turner's offense really will be centered around the running back and using the running backs in the passing game in particular. The Redskins traded for Kyle Allen, a 5th-round pick, to presumably compete with Dwayne Haskins for that QB spot. So unfortunately, we will probably have to wait until a few games into the season to see exactly what kind of offense this is going to be. But with the amount of running backs on that team, I'm not drafting any one of them. And honestly, the only player I'd really be interested in is TJ McLaurin, and to me it depends on what kind of price you get him for, because to me he's not a number 1 receiver with that offense that he's in. Next, we got Mike McCarthy. So he has never had a running back like Ezekiel Elliott. You look back at probably the 2 biggest, best running backs he's had was Eddie Lacy and Ryan Grant. Very long history of coaching, goes back to Marty Schottenheimer and Mike Nolan, 2 very different, 2 different mindsets there, I think. And another thing that's kind of weird about this hiring is that he retained Kellen Moore as the offensive coordinator. I don't know if that was something that Jerry Jones, forced upon him or what, but Kellen Moore last year was forced into adapting to Jason Garrett's offense, and the Cowboys had one of the best offenses in 2019. I saw this pretty cool stat from Dallas Cowboys General, article by David Howman. Dallas ranked 2nd last year in pace of play after ranking 24th in 2018. So they really ramped that pace of play up. In situations where the game was within 1 score, they ran the fastest pace. When they were trailing by a touchdown or more, they had the 2nd fastest pace. But when Dallas led by a touchdown or more, the offense slowed down by more than 4 seconds per play. So when they were up, they really slowed it down. They really tried to milk it. They really just kind of sat back and let Zeke just chew up the clock, which is what you should do when you have an all-world running back and you're paying them to be an all-world running back. That ability to adapt is really impressive to me, especially for a young play caller, and not even looking at the rankings of the offense as a whole, for them to, be able to really change their pace of play like that is impressive to me. The Cowboys ranked number 2 in passing yards, number 5 in passing touchdowns, number 5 in rushing yards, and they were number 7th in rushing touchdowns. So they got it done both in the running game and in the passing game. Staying in the NFC East, we got Joe Judge going down from Boston down to the New York Football Giants. Like all coaches under Bill Belichick, Judge coached a lot of different spots, but most recently he was a special teams coordinator. He seemed to me like the perfect match for the GM there, Dave Gettleman. Their offense will be called by ex-Cowboys head coach Jason Garrett. Garrett hasn't really called plays in almost 8 years since the 2013 season. Looking back at that year, the offense was headed by the 33-year-old Tony Romo with 535 passing attempts, which is pretty average. 3,800 yards, nothing good, but nothing bad. 31 touchdowns to 10 interceptions, that's pretty good. DeMarco Murray had 1,100 rushing yards and was 29 yards short of 1,500 scrimmage yards that year. He had 10 touchdowns, all this in only 14 games. Des Bryant led the team in targets with 160. It was 7th in the league. He led the team in receptions with 93, 8th in the league, and receiving yards with 1,233, which was only good for 13th in the league, which is kind of hard to believe that there were 12 receivers that had over 1,230 yards, but that's what the stats told me. So that must have been a good year for those wide receivers in 2013. And then touchdowns, he had 13 of them, 3rd in the league. So he had himself, Pro Bowl wide receiver, Pro Bowl running back, which they have one of those. They got the Pro Bowl running back for sure. So I'm not worried at all about Barkley, but we'll get to him. The one guy the one position that I wanted to really look at was the tight end. So Jason Witten was the only other pass catcher with 75 targets in 2013, that year that Jason Garrett, the last year he called plays on offense. He had 850 yards and 8 touchdowns. This tells me that Garrett is not going to have a problem getting Barkley his touches, and he knows how to use tight ends in the passing game. I don't know if he wants to funnel over 100 targets to one wide receiver like they did with Des Bryant, but there's definitely not a wide receiver on this Giants roster that fits that Des Bryant mold as of right now. Maybe Darius Slayton takes that next step, but I don't think he's earned the right for 160 targets? No way. Where were we? Yeah, so I don't know if he wants to funnel any targets to wide receivers, but one thing I did notice was Cole Beasley's target share went up every year from 2012 to 2016, the 4 years that Jason Garrett did call plays for the Cowboys, from 10% up to 21% from 2012 to 2016. That's a pretty good jump. Golden Tate is a much better receiver right now than Cole Beasley was 5 years ago, but seeing a slot receiver get 20% of the targets should be pretty encouraging for Golden Tate. 30% of the targets in that offense had an average depth of target under 5 yards. So, in fact, DeMarco Murray had 13% of his targets with an ADOT under half a yard. So they were just dumping him off the ball a lot, which I think they're going to do to Barkley. It was a lot of quick throws, quick screens and stuff like that to those slot receivers. So I think this offense is going to very much resemble that 2013 offense that we saw in Dallas. I'm most curious to see what happens to Darius Slayton in the new offense after putting up pretty good numbers last year, especially in the second half of the season. But like I said, I really don't think he's going to hit that 160 mark that we saw from Dez. You also got Sterling Shepard there. So a lot of guys, a lot of mouths to feed for sure. Let's move on to the 5 new offensive coordinators that will call plays. We got Pat Shurmur, who just left the Giants. Funny how everything kind of It's a revolving door in the NFL. Guys leave from one, they go to another. The same guy replaces him 2 years later. It's a whole nother issue. So Pat Shurmur, offensive coordinator with Denver. He was the head coach, and he called plays on offense for the Giants the last 2 seasons. He's another guy that's all about the 11 personnel, but he used his tight ends more than other coaches that majority of the time call plays from that 11 personnel. A lot of people in the biz are worried about Noah Fant's usage in particular with this Broncos offense, having just drafted 2 wide receivers with their first 2 picks in the draft and another tight end in the 4th round. I expect the Broncos to use Shurmur's favorite 11 personnel the majority of the time and have both of those rookie receivers on the field with Courtland Sutton, with Noah Fant, and with one of the running backs. They have 3 of them now. And I'm not really all that worried about Fant getting lost in the stampede, if you will, of the Denver Broncos. Now, he may not use the tight ends as much as Denver did last year. Only 2 out of the 369 offensive plays run by the Broncos last year had no tight ends on the field. So they pretty much had a tight end on every single play. But they will see plenty of work, these tight ends, for the Denver Broncos. They have a bunch of tight ends as well. I looked back at Pat Shurmur's last 4 years as a play caller to see just how much he used the tight ends. Last year with the Giants, the tight ends had a 44% target share, which is huge. Evan Ingram had 22%, Caden Smith 16%, Red Allison 7%. In 2018, the Giants only had 28% target share of their tight ends, but Ingram missed 5 games that year. 2017 with the Vikings, only 19% with Kyle Rudolph, but he did have 8 touchdowns that year. So although he didn't get the target share you'd like to see, he did get the targets in the end zone, which kind of makes up for everything when you're talking about tight ends. 2016 with the Vikings, 25% target share. Kyle Rudolph's only season with over 100 targets. He had 132 that year, so he scored 7 times. Then in 2015, the last game of the year for the Eagles, Pat Shurmur took over for Chip Kelly, and in that game, Zach Ertz led the team in catches with 9 and yards with 152. So, yeah, he's definitely, he's totally fine with getting his tight ends involved for sure. Man, I screwed up something here with my notes. What did I do? Here we go. Yeah, this is the right page. The question to me is which back gets the majority of the targets in Denver and how many? Looking back at those that same offense, Saquon Barkley had 20% of the targets last year, and the running backs had 29% of the Giants' targets the year before. It was Saquon getting 120 targets that year with Pat Shurmur. That was Pat Shurmur's first year with the Giants. In 2017, Dalvin Cook was on pace for 64 targets before he got hurt, while Jerick McKinnon and Latavius Murray combined for 84 targets. And in 2016, Vikings running backs saw over 100 targets. So Pat Shurmur, he's going to get his running backs involved. He's going to get his tight ends involved. I wouldn't be too worried about those positions. And honestly, I know the two rookies coming in are gonna be worrisome for those Courtland Sutton owners, but at the end of the day, Courtland Sutton is the big man there. They brought in those 2 rookies to make it easier for Courtland Sutton, so I really don't think he's gonna lose out too much on those wide receiver targets. God damn, what did I do with these notes here, man? Whew, I screwed up big time. So there's 1, 2, 3 new offensive coordinators, which we just started with Pat Shurmur. And then we got the rest of the Denver guys. Yeah, so last year, Phil Lindsay and Royce Freeman each saw about 50 targets, with Freeman being the much more efficient pass catcher. He had a higher catch percentage and almost half a yard more per reception than Philip Lindsay. Melvin Gordon has been one of the most consistent running backs over the last few years, averaging over 450 receiving yards from 2016 to 2018 and 4 receiving touchdowns in 2017 and 2018. But last year he had a down year. He missed the first 4 games with his holdout, and then he had to split touches with Austin Eckler. Last year, Gordon had his lowest yards per reception and his fewest targets since his rookie year. So I don't think Gordon is in position to really dominate those RB targets in Denver with Pat Shurmur calling plays. I think all 3 of these guys are going to get used. I think they're going to wait it out, and after a couple games, whoever does the best job of that is going to see the most targets. I think it's really going to be a hot hand approach. I think they're going to approach the running game aspect of these 3 guys in the same way, as whoever's playing the best is going to get the most touches. Next, we got Jay Gruden down in Jacksonville, the new offensive coordinator. He's going to run a West Coast offense designed around quick reads and down-the-field shots taken off of play action. The personnel that he's inheriting fits his system really well, with a brawler at running back in Leonard Fournette, who has showed the last couple of years that he can be great in the passing game. He caught a lot of balls over the past couple of years for a big running back like him, and a young quarterback in Gardner Minshew, who went to school at Washington State and ran that air raid offense. He had an up-and-down rookie year last year with Nick Foles kind of breathing down his neck, but now with him locked into that starting quarterback spot, I think Gardner will take that next step. They had a great draft, and they got themselves a wide receiver in Laviska Shenault, who will also fit really well into this new offensive system in Jacksonville. Chenault's probably best attribute coming into the draft this year was his ability to get off the line of scrimmage and his route running. So I think he's going to be a very good addition to this offense. Next, we got Shane Stetchen, offensive coordinator for the Los Angeles Chargers. Last year, after Ken Wisenhunt was fired as offensive coordinator, Shane Stetchen took over and immediately increased the offense's output. Their points per game went up almost 3 whole points, and they were about 30 yards more per game with Stetchen calling plays. The Chargers also ran the ball better with Stetchen, and with Melvin Gordon now in Denver, Austin Eckler is in line to be the starting running back and get the majority of the touches there. I think Stetchen will be good for the fantasy owners and Austin Eckler owners in particular. This is a very good offense that is going to get probably nowhere near enough hype because of how much talent was brought to the AFC West in the draft, with all those wide receivers going to Denver and going to Las Vegas, and with the Chiefs getting the next Brian Westbrook. So I think we might get a sleeper or two coming out of this Chargers offense, depending on what the quarterback situation looks like. Next, we got Chan Gailey coming back for his second out-of-retirement job, offensive coordinator for the Miami Dolphins. Gailey has been a coach in the NFL for years, since I think 1998 was his first job, with a couple of years off in between here and there. He was brought out of retirement to take this position under Brian Flores, and most notable aspect of this hiring is his connection with Ryan Fitzpatrick. They spent 5 seasons together, and it puts the Dolphins in the perfect position to not need Tua Tagovailoa to play right away, and it makes sure that he's 100% healed and he's ready to go. The Dolphins have made a couple moves at running back, signing Jordan Howard and trading for Matt Breida, which will obviously help because Chan Gailey has always leaned on his running backs to help open things up in the passing game. You look at his last 4 seasons calling plays, his running backs have had about 20% of the targets each year. Matt Forte, Bilal Powell, and C.J. Spiller in 2016. Chris Ivory, Bilal Powell, Stephen Ridley in 2015. Then C.J. Spiller and Fred Jackson in 2011 and 2012. All 4 of those years were headed by Ryan Fitzpatrick at quarterback. So there's going to be familiarity there. There's going to be some cohesion with Chan Gailey and Ryan Fitzpatrick. I think if the offensive line can play better, which you got to assume they have to play better because there's no way they can play any worse, with better running backs, with another year for Fitzpatrick to get comfortable with those wide receivers there, I think we could see the Dolphins' offense be much better this season than it was last year. And the last offensive coordinator that will most likely be calling plays is Gary Kubiak, offensive coordinator with the Minnesota Vikings. Kubiak moves from assistant head coach to offensive coordinator while Stefanski leaves for Cleveland. In Mike Zimmer's 6 seasons as head coach there, he's had 4 different offensive coordinators. Stefanski in 2019, John DeFilippo in 2018, Pat Shurmur in 2017, and Norv Turner in 2016. So Norv Turner was also coordinator there in 2015 and 2014. So I had the longest stint with Norv Turner. If you're calling plays and you don't run the ball enough, simply put, Zimmer is going to fire your ass. I think this hiring of Gary Kubiak is as best of a fit as they're going to get in Minnesota. Kubiak has proven history of making sure that his running backs touch the ball enough. In Kubiak's last 3 years as either the head coach for Denver, including their 2015 Super Bowl season, and the offensive coordinator for Baltimore in 2013, I think it was. The fullback, running back positions have averaged 357 carries and 88 targets over those 3 years. That might still not be enough for Mike Zimmer. Looking at last year for the Vikings, Dalvin Cook, Alexander Madison, Amir Abdullah, Mike Boone, and C.J. Ham all combined for 430 carries and 225 targets. So we'll see if Kubiak is safe at year's end, but as far as the passing game goes, I think it will continue to be predicated around getting the ball out quick. I was actually listening to an interview earlier today with Gary Kubiak from back in February, and he said that the best thing Kirk Cousins did last year was get the ball out fast. So maybe we see a little bit more of the West Coast concepts, but for the most part, I really don't think this offense is going to change all that much. Really the only difference is going to be that number 2 wide receiver there, with them having Jefferson now instead of Stephon Diggs. All right, we got about 4 minutes left. We got 2 new offensive coordinators that I don't think are really going to call plays. I think their head coach is still going to call plays, and that starts with Bill Lazor in Chicago. He was the OC for the Bengals in 2018 under Marv Lewis, but was out of football last year. He joins new quarterback coach John DeFilippo and head coach Matt Nagy to try and get more out of Mitchell Trubisky. That is the number one objective, is to get some better play out of this dude. He was so the Bears moved up to the second pick in 2017 to draft Mitchell Trubisky ahead of current Super Bowl MVP Patrick Mahomes and Deshaun Watson. So Matt Nagy's system has not yet really taken off in Chicago, and if Trubisky can't take that next step this season, he's done with the Bears. They have already declined his 5th-year option, and they have traded for Nick Foles, who is very familiar with Matt Nagy's system and has worked with DeFilippo in Philly when they won the Super Bowl a couple years ago. I don't see Lazor really having a real impact on this offense as far as play calling goes. I think Nagy retains that responsibility, so this hiring is one of the least impactful hirings in my opinion. To me, it's really going to come down to whether or not he can really help Mitchell Trubisky become a better quarterback or not. And in fact, if we go into 2021 and Trubisky's not there, I don't think Matt Nagy or DeFilippo or Bill Lazor, I don't think any of them are there. I think the Bears will just completely clean house and start fresh. And last but not least, we got Kevin O'Connell with the Los Angeles Rams. Head coach Sean McVay will continue to call plays for the Rams. I've outlined it a few times now on this podcast, but the Rams offense made a pretty big change midway through the season last year. They started involving their tight ends way more than they had in the past, most notably Tyler Higbee, who averaged double-digit targets over his last 6 games. The tight end position finished last season with 24.5% of the targets in Los Angeles, compared to just 17% in 2018 and 15% in 2017. Brandon Cooks missed 2 games, and he left a 3rd game early. Also, Todd Gurley's role in the offense drastically changed from 2017 and 2018 to 2019. Gurley averaged 270 carries a year in 16, 17, and 18, and then just 223 carries in 2019. So a drop off of almost 50 carries, which is about 3 or 4 a game. Even more impactful was his drop in the involvement in the passing game. So he went from 84 targets a season in 17 and 18 to just 49 in 2019. That's a lot. That's what, 35 targets. That's, it may not sound like a lot, but 3 targets a game is a lot to lose out on when you're talking about running backs. Cooks was traded to Houston before the draft, and the Rams used the second-round pick that they got on him on Van Jefferson, a really good slot receiver prospect from Florida. But I don't see him making a big impact this year. Maybe he steps right into the Brandon Cooks role, running those deep routes, but I don't think he'll see enough targets. This offense has had an average 455 targets over the last 3 years with Sean McVay and Jared Goff there at quarterback. So if Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods get half of that, which puts them each at about 140 targets, which is pretty much right on line what they've done over the past 2 years. And then the tight ends, Gerald Everett and Tyler Higbee, each get about 75 to 80. And another 50 or so go to the group of running backs. That only leaves about another 75 to 80 for the whole rest of the team. So you're talking their 3rd, 4th, and 5th wide receivers, and the rest of the tight ends that don't include Gerald Everett and Tyler Higbee. So I'm not too crazy about Van Jefferson this year, but maybe more so next year or the year after that. I'm not saying it was a bad pick by them, but definitely somebody I'm going to avoid this season. So that's going to do it for the coaching changes of 2020. I feel like there's not as many this year as there was last year, which should be a good thing for them with the craziness that is the world these days and not really knowing of when we can get back to real football. Hopefully it happens sooner rather than later. So thank you for tuning in. Make sure you check us out next week, which we will be talking about keepers and dynasty leagues. I'm going to have 2 guests on that have been in both of these leagues for years, and I think they have a lot of really good insight into these 2 types of league formats. So I'm excited about it. Thanks again for tuning in. Make sure you check us out next week, and as always, may the fantasy gods be cruel to your opponents.
You have been listening to the Kickin' or Stickin' Fantasy Football Podcast. For more great episodes and information, follow us on social media and tune in every week. Kickin' or Stickin' is available on Google Podcasts, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Alexa, Reach.tv, or your favorite podcast service. Kickin' or Stickin' is a proud member of the HC Universal Network family of podcasts. To find out more about this and other great shows on our network, visit us online at hcuniversalnetwork.com today. Fantasy football is fun, but gambling addiction destroys lives. If you or someone you love suffers from gambling addiction, please do not be afraid to seek help. The National Council on Problem Gambling operates the National Problem Gambling Helpline Network. Contact them today at 1-800-522-4700. Thank you for tuning in to the Kickin' or Stickin' Fantasy Football Podcast. Please remember to play responsibly and always look for your man downfield.